Hi, I'm Michelle Tennant. I am the current president in the year 2023 and 2024 of Henderson County Beekeepers Association in beautiful Western North Carolina. You probably know us as the Great Smoky Mountains, but I am really pleased to bring you a special interview with somebody that I met at the recent summer conference with the North Carolina State Beekeepers Association, and it's Krispn Given. Hi, Krispn.
Hello, how are you doing?
Good. Should we call you Professor Given or Krispn, or what's your preference?
Crispin's fine.
Krispn's fine. Now, what people might not know is that you are all about biting back on the mites. And so when we're talking about honeybees, and a lot of people are like, what are we even talking about? When we're talking about honeybees, first of all, we need to tell them why we have a mite problem, and then why do we have to bite back? So Krispn, what do you normally tell people when you're at a cocktail party and they say, what do you do? What's your 1-2 over cocktails?
Well, I would tell them, I'm a honeybee breeder, so I've been engaged in honeybee breeding now for 26 years and going on 20 years at Purdue University. So as you mentioned, we're breeding the bee that bites the mite. So recently I've been talking about, what we're doing and how we're trying to defeat this parasite. So I'm not going to bore everybody with Varroa Destructor biology and all this stuff. We all know Varroa is a big problem. So the consensus among, scientists globally is Varroa Destructor is by far the number one factor associated to colony mortality. So something we've been doing at Purdue University is we've been breeding bees. So we have a breeding program that has anywhere from 120 to 300 colonies. And we're selecting on behavioral mechanisms. So bees have a few behaviors in their toolbox. So they have what we call grooming, and they have general hygiene, and then they have VSH. This is Varroa sensitive hygiene.
Okay, we're going to get into all of the details of that. But because this is on YouTube, I want to take a step back, because you and I, as beekeepers, we know what the Varroa mite is, right? The Varroa Destructor mite.
Yes, yeah.
And just if you're wanting to know more about honeybees and you found yourself in this conversation all of a sudden, I don't want to exclude you. I'm looking for something that's like a big circle in my office to show you. Let's just say that these markers, right? This is a mite on me, and it's
colorful mites.
sucking the life out of me, right? That's basically what we're dealing with as beekeepers. My uncles were beekeepers too, but they were beekeepers decades ago. They didn't have to deal with a Varroa mite that was that large on the bees,
Right.
the honeybees. And a lot of people like to say, you know how like we hate the ticks on us, but the ticks are pretty small. But can you imagine if the tick was that large? That's what we're dealing with. And that's why we really need to help the honeybees, because they're dealing with these pests and these parasites. So I also want to show people, as you're talking, there's a few places to learn about Purdue University's information. So if you go to Purdue University's website and you go to the honeybee extension here, but you gave me an easier way to get in here. What did we search to get here, Krispn?
You just Googled a Purdue beehive.
Purdue beehive. Okay, and then you're going to find this, and then you can actually learn a little more about what we're speaking about right now. Okay, with that said, let's go back into the conversation about those three areas and why it's important to look at those three areas and how we're actually your genetic, or is it like a genetic modification, or like what's actually happening at your in your studies so we can understand that.
Well, if you go all the way back to the origin of our breeding program, we started basically just selecting on colonies that grew the fewest mites. So then there was a paradigm shift, in 2007, we decided to look at mite biting, because we noticed some of the mites, when we placed them on their backs on these glass slides, we noticed that some of the legs were missing and the shell or the idiosoma, there was bites, parts of it taken out. So we decided to start selecting on that. So you can think of it as a hierarchical selection. So we look at grooming behavior and then mite biting. So we know that grooming and mite biting are correlated. And as of now, we've only identified one gene that's responsible, and that's Nerexin 1. And all we know is that it correlates with grooming, and that gene is it's a synaptic response in the brain of the honeybee. It's upregulated. There's more response to the higher groomers. But what was really exciting was the ones that groom more also chewed more mites. So there's a correlation. But we don't know if it's, recessive or dominant. We don't know that yet. So there's a lot of areas to still discover.
Okay, so all of a sudden, maybe it's because I've been watching too many episodes of Black Mirror and Twilight Zone, but all of a sudden my brain just kind of exploded. Like, okay,
Yes.
so you're actually, when you're doing the queen rearing, and you're actually then looking at traits that are favorable and to really keep the mites at bay.
Correct.
The ones that essentially that are just, when we talk about grooming, we think of like brushing our hair,
Yeah.
brushing our teeth, things that they're grooming inside their hives.
Yeah.
And those that are grooming are actually are able to fight. Well, we always say that about our hives, right? Healthy hive is one that is powerful enough to have extra resources to groom well and to be healthy, and just like humans, right? So I'm really curious about how that's actually done. Like, how did you land on those genetic traits? Like, that's fascinating to me.
Yeah. So we just, when we first started selecting on my bike, so we have what we call auto grooming. And so what happens is a bee can actually groom himself or herself. So they groom the mice off, and then there's other bees that may bite the mite, or she'll bite the mite herself. So in the beginning, when we looked at this, we were at about 5%. And then around 2015, we achieved about 50%. So there was a response to selection. So the take home message is this is a heritable trait that's beneficial to beekeepers and reduces mortality. So we've conducted 4 comparison studies, and they all basically came with the same conclusion. The selected stock did much better than the unselected stock. And so you think of bee breeding as it's not really a goal, it's a process. So you have to constantly select. So to get these traits, we need to have what we call controlled mating. So to achieve this, you need to use instrumental insemination. So we employ that. So we basically just cross the highs to highs, so the best to the best to get those results. But something you must keep in mind is there's not a bottleneck of traits only. So we're not only looking at mite grooming and mite biting, we're also look for if there's any disease, general disease. For example, when I started, we had some chalk brood, and we were able to breed that out within about 3 years. Because in the springtime, when I made my nucleus colonies up, there would be, around 30, 40% that had chalk brood every year. So we selected out. So we're also being vigilant about everything else in the colony. So gentleness, for example. So you can, keep other traits in check too as you're selecting for the most important traits.
So you're in a university setting, learning all these wonderful things about your um inside the research, and then you're
Mhm.
disseminating the information at conferences where we then find you. But
Okay.
still, I'm like curious, as a backyard beekeeper. I have 2 homesteads. How can I actually implement some of the research that you're finding? Like, what do I need to do in my apiaries to also include these traits? Like, do I need to get it from a special apiary? But how do I implement what you're finding?
Yeah, so another thing I'd mention is, all bees here in this country are basically mongrels. They're not pure, as like in Europe, there's more pure strains, for example. Here in the US, it's kind
Did
of,
you just call my babies mongrels?
Yes.
I'm
So if
like
you have,
mutts. Like you just called my dog a mutt, my pure breed of mutt.
yes,
I got you. Okay. Okay.
yes.
Mongrels. Okay.
So they're not pure in that sense. So for example, if you have, say, Italian, I call them Italian-like, Caucasian-like. So if you have a Italian bee, for example, it might have Carnica mitochondria. So the bottom line is all these traits that I'm talking about, VSH, general hygiene, mite biting, grooming, they're all within these different ecotypes of bees, for example. So as a beekeeper, the number one thing you can do is just monitor your mites. And the easiest selection point is just producing queens, locally adapted queens for your area is the best, I think, approach for a backyard beekeeper.
Adapt
And
adapt the bees to your environment. Okay.
yeah,
Um,
local stock, there's something there because there's an environmental factor too when you're selecting. So, and then select off colonies, that grow the fewest mites. And then also the colonies, in the springtime, say you have 20 hives. The colony that produces the drones first or earliest in the spring, that's a good selection index also because for whatever reason, that colony feels happy. All the cylinders are firing. So you could breed off of that one because it's producing drones early, it's healthy. So that's a good sign. They're thinking about reproduction earlier than the other units.
wow. Okay. Those are some good takeaways, I think, for especially people who are interested in queen rearing. And once you become your beginner beekeeper, it's all coming at you very
Yeah.
quickly. Once you really, you're getting into your 4 or 5 year mark, things start to really make sense and you want to then take it to the next level. So I think this is even an additional level where you can start to think about um like what actually contributes to the bee health directly.
Oh, yes, yes. You hit the
Right.
nail on the head. Yeah, the health, because we always talk about the loss of bees. We're losing colonies, and yes, we're losing many colonies, but the biology of bees makes it easy to replace them. For example, if I have 10 colonies and I lose five of them, I can easily split my five colonies that survived and get more bees, produce more queens. But yes, you won't get the honey that you want. So this isn't sustainable for, say, the commercial industry or any hobby beekeeper who wants to produce honey so. But you have to think about it. It's the health of the bees. It's what we don't see. So this ectoparasitic mite, Varroa Destructor, it's not what we see that's causing our problems. What we don't see. So it's parasite that's vectoring viruses. So it's a vector parasite. So DWV, for example, deformed wing virus, that's the number one mortality factor with the viruses. And Varroa, the presence of Varroa, like right now in our colonies, our Varroa populations are getting higher and higher after we harvest our honey in the fall, of course. So you see a more prevalence of viruses or the negative impacts of viruses associated with that mite.
Sorry, my mother is all of a sudden giving me a few texts and calls, so I
Okay.
apologize for the interruption. Mom is also very interested in the bees, I have to tell you, and loves
Oh,
to
that's
help me
cool.
extract the honey. But when we talk about this time of year, and we're recording this at the end of August, early September, and when our mite loads are very high, I often find conversations, between beekeepers, and everyone says you ask 100 beekeepers one question, you're going to get 100,
Yes.
maybe 101
Yes.
different answers, right? Um,
Yes.
what about uh, it reminds me of nature nurture, right? Depends on who you ask. But I'm a person who eats organically. I like the more natural side of life, right? So I'm trying to really do what's right for my own family. And I do the same for my dogs, chickens, and my bees. But I'm
Yep.
really finding it difficult to do what's right for the bees naturally. I get there's always conversations about amongst beekeepers that you should use more chemicals, less chemicals, this or that. And then you go to conferences and then you hear about how it used to be with bees, and that when we look at the research, that if you spread bees, don't keep them all close together in your apiary, but if you spread them out amongst, and then you're like, I can't even do that as a beekeeper. It says
Right.
it's not even
Yes.
physically possible. What about those types of arguments, Crispin, when it comes to our fight and this whole biting back piece, bees together, chemical, natural, all those things? What do you see from your perspective as a professor and a
Well,
researcher?
ideally, we don't want to put pesticides or miticides in our colonies. And that's one advantage of bee breeding is it eliminates that or cuts down on it if you have to use it. And if you do, I mean, I recommend, like we use oxalic acid. We've used that in the past, and that works really well. But I know today, and you mentioned also there's like a million things going off in my head. So I would say numbers of colonies, yes, having the architecture of the apiary, yes, that is a problem. I mean, if we call it a monoculture, so if you have 25 colonies in a checkerboard pattern in the apiary, yeah, they're probably, if you have an outbreak of virus or high mites, there's going to be a horizontal transfer to the healthy colonies, or they get robbed out and transfer the virus. But if you take those same 20 colonies and you have them spaced out, a few meters apart with, along an area where they don't drift as much, yeah, the colonies will be healthier. It makes sense if you think about it, but it's not practical for life. So, a commercial beekeeper with 1,000 colonies isn't going to put. So it's like your cattle. I mean, we have a bunch of cattle together. They're going to get sick, so you got to think of honeybees as animals. So we just need to figure out the industry. We need to also, not just as researchers, but the industry itself, the queenering industry. So most people produce queens or queeners. There's only a handful of bee breeders. So what we need is more serious bee breeders. Most people produce mini queens, and some confuse that with bee breeding. So
Oh yeah, well, say more about what you did, because I was going to go off on a whole different topic about cows and keep poop in the loop, and this documentary Kiss the Ground that I just saw with Woody Harrelson. But then you just said something different that's very interesting, because I've always thought of like, oh yeah, when I retire, I'm going to really get into queen rearing. But then you just said let's have more bee breeders. So let's go into deep on that. What is the difference, and how would how would we identify ourselves as a potential for that?
yeah, so queen rearing basically you want to produce many queens, and you want to have healthy, productive, the best queens, superior queens. And so they're basically, you just produce many queens, and there's no selection index. Where with bee breeding, you have certain phenotypes, we call them, that you're selecting for. So gentleness, or you have an assay, you have a goal, that whatever trait you want to select for. So color, if you want bees that are dark or lighter. So you come out with certain traits that you like, and in the end, within 3 to 5 years, you'll see results of that. Because in the beginning of your selection process is the greatest diversity. So you want to start selecting with many diverse sources, ideally in the beginning, and then narrow it down through selection. So there's a big difference between the two. So there's non-selection with queen rearing, and then there's high selection with bee breeding.
Very clear. It reminds me of what we humans have done with the wolf, now called dog.
Oh, yes. Yeah, that's amazing. Yes.
Right? We've really like selected traits in dogs that
Yes.
in the same way. So what you're really proposing is we do the same thing with bees that we've done with dogs for centuries, right?
Well, with dogs, they have standards. I think with honeybees, it's not a really good idea to have a standard, because you have to
Why not?
because that's part of the problem. With standards, you have more bottlenecks in some cases. Like with all, you
Okay.
have, but yeah, you could have some soft standards. Like if okay, we want this stock to all be light or whatever. But I think important to have more flexibility with honey, because the problem with bee breeding is what we call this haploidy diploidy, and they mate on the wing. So queens go out, they mate on the wing, and they call them drone congregationaries, DCAs. And then honeybees also have the highest rate of recombination. So genes are switching, reshuffling, and so things change through time also. So it's very difficult to get something that's perfectly the same always. So you have
It
to
also,
constantly select for the trait. So if you want, bees that are, you know, grooming and mite biting, you have to constantly select. You can't sit back and enjoy the fruits of your hard work. You have to constantly select on a trait to keep it going. And that's what keeps some people from pursuing it, because it requires a lot of work and you have a lot of skill. So you need to have, a good pair of eyes, pair of hands to work with. And there's a lot of, specialized equipment you need to use and learn to use, like external insemination. If you don't have an island like they do, for example, in Canada, they got the
right,
Flora Island and
right.
University of Guelph. But still, even in that situation, you need to use, I like using single drone insemination. So this is a queen that is inseminated with one drone. So a drone yields about 1 microliter of semen. So that's quite a bit of semen from one drone. So it's about 6 million sperm cells. So that queen may live for, or she may be productive as far as passing on offspring, 6, 8 months. So just enough for, producing daughters from her. It amplifies trait selection.
Doesn't that, like, just having one mate like that? Because as I understand that the queens really have many, many mates, and so it doesn't. Couldn't the reverse be true, that weakens them because it doesn't have diversity in the genetic pool?
Oh yeah, they're like the worst. I mean, those queens, tend to get superseded within, 6 months, or they become drone layers. But think of them as a tool. So the queen, we're not judging the colony's fitness, for example, by its queen. We're judging it by its progeny. So I'll produce, maybe 100 daughters from that single drone inseminated queen. And then those queens will be open-mated and some inseminated, and in some cases with multiple inseminations or another SDI. So it's just a tool for increasing the propensity for a trait,
So it
because
might
all
be
the sperm.
got
Mhm.
it. So it might be the same way that we use maybe a nuke, right? So we have like our healthy hives, then we might just keep one queen with a small nuke just as a tool to kind of be resources for all of our other hives. It's sort of what you're saying there.
Yeah, some beekeepers do that.
Okay.
They'll have nucleus colonies to produce brood and things,
Yes.
extra sources, and yeah.
Excellent. Well, what else should we know other I think that people would love to know about your award.
Oh,
So like let's I would love to for you to talk about like this award that you literally just got a few days ago. So
oh,
talk to us about this award. What is this for?
oh, I I'm just really honored. It's the EAS Roger Morse Award, and it's just a great honor to get that. And I'm just really humbled by it.
If you go to beeculture.com and you put in Crispin's name, his name is Krispn Given. No S at the end of Given, by the way. Remember, we talked
It's
about that
easy.
at the conference. It is. You can read more about this award. And by the way, one of the things that I thought was kind of interesting when we met at the conference was you told me a little bit about the history of your name. It's Irish.
Yes, yes.
Tell us a little bit
It's a
about that.
Celtic name. Well, it's the way I understand it's more of an Irish. Of course, they have it, in Asia, like for example, in the Philippines, they have a Crispin. But I think the origin of it is, some people, it may be Christianity, but it's more of a Irish history, the way I understand. But I don't know the exact origins as far. I may be wrong, but that's what I've been told, and I've
Neat.
had.
I
Yeah.
love I love the history of people's names and what do what really are you passionate about that got you started in beekeeping and what are you hoping for in the next decade from all of us as beekeepers?
Oh, wow, that's a question we had a panel at EAS and they asked us this. And, I've thought about the future and, like when I first started, when I was a kid, my first love was ants, these little tetramorium paver ants, we call them. So that was my first love. And then my dad had bees and he's the one that got me into beekeeping. So I started keeping bees around 8, but seriously around the age of 9. And
Neat.
the future, I would say, hopefully we can get a handle on Varroa Destructor and eliminate it, or at least have it to where there's a relationship that's comfortable between Varroa Destructor and the Apis mellifera. But it looks like it's going to be a while before that happens.
Yeah, because
So
there's now another parasite that's brewing that I learned at conference that it's not over
yeah,
here yet, but we're pretty we're hoping that we can get that under control before it comes over here. Some of
yeah,
my staff members actually at my PR firm also they've been third generation beekeepers. They're over in Eastern Europe. And what can we do worldwide, Crispin, with the other beekeepers? Like, what kind of conversations should I be having with, Anita, for example, who's on my staff, who, and we talk about mite treatments all the time and how to feed and the different architecture of the apiary. What else should we be talking about?
yeah. I mean, if look what's happening in Australia. I mean, before they were Varroa free, now we have Varroa. It's unleashed there, and they're probably not going to get control of it. So I would say there, for example, they should learn from what we did, and it would be great to maybe import stock from the U.S. or some other places have Varroa, or Russia, for example, the Primorske region of Russia was the first place to get Varroa. So get bees that already have you know experience living with Varroa, get them there quickly because it's probably going to get out of control. I mean, I had a conversation with an Australian beekeeper a few weeks ago, and they basically said that it's not under control and it's something that they're really worried about. So I think bee breeding, again, that's something that's really going to come more into light there also, where they're selecting against it. But get stock now that's already somewhat resistant and get that there instead of, because if not, it's probably, there's going to be a lot of mortality like we experienced in the US, or there
Gosh,
will be. Yeah.
forgive me for this example, but it's as complex as COVID, isn't it? I mean, it's
Yeah,
really,
it's a pandemic if you think about it. We know we're having this long-standing pandemic with it's again the viruses this think of Varroa as a dirty hypodermic needle, so it's vectoring these viruses, and so the immune system of the colony. So we describe the colony as a super organism. So think of each bee as a circuit. So you get one bee in there that's infected with deformed wing virus, and it's passed to the colony quickly, rapidly, and that's what's decimating colonies globally is these viruses associated with the mites. Because it seems like years ago, it seemed when Varroa first came, it seemed like, I remember we had thousands of mites when we first treated them with like coumaphos and fluvalamate. You remember that stuff, checkmite, and you didn't see a lot of DWV, for example, or deformed wings. Now you see, seems like you see more deformed wing virus. So the viruses are also changing, and
yeah.
maybe there's it's more virulent with fewer mites too. So we still get viruses, of course, in any breeding program. You're still going to have deleterious effects, we call them, or negative effects, even though you're breeding. So you have to select those out or cull them out. So the viruses are mutating also, they're changing. And another thing that needs to be thought about is that the uh, the Varroa mites behavior, they're also changing. We don't hear a lot of conversation about this, but the mites are also adapting and changing. So in
Sure.
theory, we're selecting for more virulent mites. The higher selection pressure we put on the colony, on the mites, the more response they have also. So
It's
that
just
has
like
to be thought
not to
about.
belabor the
Yeah.
dog analogy, but the same thing
Yes.
happens with our flea and tick medications, right? How is
Yeah.
that? What can we look forward to with your research next, and how can people reach you?
right now, I mean, something a little off side project. We just identified a gene that's associated with a mutation in the eye of drones. So some drones have what we call white eyes, chartreuse eyes, or we describe them as ivory colored eyes. So we've identified that one gene. Nobody's ever done this in our lab.
Wow.
And
Congratulations.
yeah, Brock
Good
Harper
work.
is my colleague, and he had this dream 17 years ago. He wanted to find out what the genes were behind these eye colors. So he finally got one, and I'm really happy that he was out. So we also found maybe there's two more genes associated with a variation of these. There's variations in eye color. So there may be, really white, this almost ghost-like, and then you'll have a chartreuse, and then you'll have like a kind of like a, I don't know, like a ivory color, we call it. So there's variations in eye colors, and there's different genes associated with those. So pearl eye is what I'm thinking of. So, which some of them
Gotcha.
look pearly. So
So we can look forward to more gene selection based on what the eye colors are actually then selecting for. Like we might, one of the things that I realized, with my own bees, I had darker bees and then I had strawberry blonde bees, and I could see a difference in behavior with them. It was very obvious, like that I just had like these different bees and different hives. Tell people, I've got your email address is kgiven at purdue.edu, but
yep.
also I saw honeybee at purdue.edu.
Yeah, that's an email that if you use that email, it'll go to Brock Harper and myself. So we split that
Nice.
email.
Okay, great. So people want to reach you, they can reach you through Purdue. And I
Yes.
really appreciate the time that you've spent with me today to, educate people about how we can fight by having the bees bite back. And
Yes.
any final words on what we should be doing as beekeepers or just enthusiasts who are curious about bee health, pollinator
Yeah, I
health?
mean, the take home message, bee breeding is important, and bees are fighting back, and we can increase the propensity of that through selective breeding. And through time, we'll find that it's become, it'll be more important. More people, for example, are interested in breeding now. So now I have more students that are wanting to learn instrumental insemination, for example. And so there's a lot of people who want to make a difference. So collectively, maybe we here in the Midwest, we inspired some beekeepers, we call them micro breeders. So we had 7 states that each had their micro breeders. So they were selecting mite resistant bees. They maybe had VSH, they had general hygiene. So get something going, think about bee breeding, and maybe in your club, one person could learn instrumental insemination, and you could purchase an instrument collectively and share it or use it. And it's the queens that you produce, give those to your other beekeepers in your state. So it's important to have local stock and to disseminate them among each other, because very often we want to go next door and we think that's the best stuff, but that's usually not the case. I mean, last few years I've been telling people that sometimes the best bees are right in your backyard. You just need to select for that.
Local wins again, right? So,
Yeah,
like we like to say at Henderson County Beekeepers, local honey, local mentors.
yeah,
Now we need to be adding local breeders or something like
yeah,
that,
yeah, yeah.
something like
There's a
that.
lot of enthusiasm, with that.
All
You have
right,
all these beekeepers no, beekeepers are extremely, they're very independent thinkers, but they're
we
also
are,
very creative,
we
and they
are.
have a lot of but working together, or maybe you can form a co-op. So I think this is important, and as we see more in resistance to amatraz, for example. There's really nothing in the pipeline. I mean, so bee breeding is really helping, again, eliminates the use of pesticides and miticides. And so that's good. We don't want to put that stuff in our hives.
Well, Crispin, thank you so much for your
Yeah.
time, and it's been a pleasure. And
Yeah. Great doing
I'll
this.
stay in touch with you for sure.
Sure, yeah, it's nice meeting you. And I remember I was so tired that day when we first met. Okay.
You were, I didn't notice that you were tired at all.
Yeah, I
I'm about to
was.
have a coughing fit, so I'm going to
Uh-oh.
sign off here, but hang out for just a second. Bye,
Okay.
everybody.